Before 400 years of black people having to come to terms with these kinds of vicious murders and assassinations and attacks.
I would think, I think that we have to put it in context, especially when you talk about the history of policing Black bodies in the United States in particular. The police force stems from the slave patrol. And so we're talking about a 4-year history of first slave patrol, Jim Crow, the lynch mob, sheriffs. And so the stereotypes, I would probably say that the stereotypes that have existed about Black people's inhumanity and Black people being less than human, and the concepts of Black people being property that emerged from enslavement and moved through Jim Crow, through the civil rights movement, through the Civil Rights Act. And here, I think that, we try to divorce these contemporary phenomena from history, but lynching is a very, very integral and brutal part of American history. And I think that what we're seeing now is just a continuation of what it has been in the past. The difference is that technology now allows us to now see it and share it through these social media platforms. And so what we're experiencing today is actually no better than what our ancestors have experienced in the past. And I think until we start delving into the systemic and the root of oppression, the root of state-sponsored violence, and begin to change that culture of the way that African Americans are perceived here in America, and also the way that police are trained to deal with African Americans from a historic and a cultural perspective, it's only gonna, we know it, it's a new officer, a new hashtag, a new name, a new protest, you rest, and then we start all over again. So I think that until we start addressing the systemic and historic root of state-sponsored violence, that we're going to keep seeing the same thing.
Definitely, listen, the arrogance factor is definitely there. Certainly. I mean, even in the face, get this, even in the face of the news media, right? Even in the face of the news media. I mean, it strikes you in a way where you have to pinch yourself and say, am I really, watching this? Do I see this? So, but also again, in the sort of devaluation of Black bodies, right? Who also happen to be human, right? But, you almost get this sense that, well, how many other times have we, murdered Black folk and nothing has happened, right? Nothing has happened. And so in many ways, this behavior has been justified time and time again by the system, right? By the system. And so, I mean, if I were an officer who had such animus against these individuals, I mean, why not? Who's going to check me?
I wrote an article 2 years ago, and the article was called Post-Traumatic Slave Master Syndrome. And I think that, again, the history of lynching is where white male state actors invoke violence and death upon Black people with impunity. And so, the cultures that they come from, until it's publicized, I think that, too many, not all, but I think that too many police departments have this culture of disregard for Black life. And so in the moment, I looked at his face. I did not watch the video. I refused to watch the video. But I looked at the photo. And one of the things that I do when I look at photos is I cover the mouth and the nose and I look at the eyes. And what you just said, I saw. And I think in the moment that they really think that they're not going to be held accountable, because the history has shown that very few officers get held accountable when they abuse or murder Black bodies. And so, I think that, the culture that they are trained in, the culture that they exist in, I think that plays a big part in the way that they perceive their actions as being either wrong, right, or within the culture or outside of the culture.
What we seem to see time and time again is that these reforms, they just don't seem to work, They don't seem to work. And many times the reforms come in the sort of, in these disguises as, well, race-based training. And we have to better prepare them to be, more culturally competent and such. But they don't mean anything, unfortunately, Pete, if they don't come with consequences for their actions. If you were in any other profession and you stepped out of line, you'd be terminated. And so unfortunately for people who've been experiencing this for 400 years and counting, many of them, they just don't see how reform is going to cut it. Because reform always has a way of slipping right back into these, again, racialized anti-Black carceral tactics.
I do. Oftentimes what I found as what I like to consider myself a more radical or revolutionary activist, the seat at the table comes with the price. And sometimes the seat at the table is more important to us than the cause. A lot of times they don't want radical and real voices to hold people really, really accountable for the systemic transformations that are needed within the system. And so we do have Black faces in high places that pretty much kind of regurgitate the rhetoric or keep things comfortable. And this conversation and the work to be done is a very uncomfortable work and conversation. And so until we get real people who are ready to and willing to risk the comfort of acceptability to force people to address the issue, it's still going to be the same cycle.
I think we have to reimagine a new system that is actually truly democratic. Unfortunately, in this racialized white supremacist society, Blacks continue to be viewed through and controlled, frankly, through this paternalistic lens, which is to say that we have never fully participated in this democratic society. And this is despite the 60s, right? Despite being brought into the, voting process. And so I would hope that in this new imagined system, Blacks would have voice in how they are governed. We would have voice in how we are policed, because in the current system, we just don't have voice. We don't have voice. We've taken to the streets time and time again. We have revolted during slavery, during Jim Crow, and even still no voice, right? And this despite the fact that America goes across seas claiming that they're bringing democracy to Afghanistan and so forth and so on, and don't have it at home. I do research on policing in the community, in particular around race issues. And these are questions that often come up, and also, concerns. And even around community policing, many people felt that, for the most part, it was an intelligence operation that led more and more people in the community into the system. And yet, let the technocrats tell it, it was supposed to be something that brought community and police together. That it was supposed to be a collaborative partnership of sorts. But unfortunately, the white supremacist state always has a way, unfortunately, of going right on back to what it was doing before. So you always sort of have to question these notions of reform. What really is that? And, if the voices of the most affected are not at the top of, what that means, if their voices are not included in that, then you must reject. You must reject.
So, I do know of some police forces that I have relationships with in my area who have really who have started to engage a community policing model. And that really involved them really getting immersed in the community, getting to know the community members, especially at my school, because I teach at an HBCU, which is a historically Black college or university. And so in the surrounding areas, two of the surrounding areas, our police force are largely white males. In one surrounding area, it's largely African American. And so the two surrounding areas, Petersburg and Chesterfield, have really, really committed to really being engaged with our campus community, with our students. And they've really engaged a real community policing model where they have a genuine concern and investment in the university community where they're mostly African Americans. And so I see that as kind of being radical reform work, and it has really worked well, especially for me being a professor and an activist who loves my students, it was really important for me to do that work to try to make sure that those surrounding areas are really looking out, because I did not and do not want anything like this to ever happen to any of my babies.